One of my seminary professors once said, "People, if you have to explain a symbol to death, it isn't working." And he was speaking of the symbolic nature of the sacraments, baptism and Eucharist primarily, and how the symbols work. The outward and visible sign, which for baptism is water and oil and community, and bread and wine and community for the Eucharist. So these outward and visible signs are symbolic of inward and spiritual grace. That's the definition of sacrament, the outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Now, the Gospel of John is unique among the four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic Gospels, meaning they contain a sort of synopsis of Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, and resurrection, as were found meaningful for each of those communities, Matthew's community, Mark's, and Luke's. They are meant to be read for their meaning, for their good news, and not as a truly historical account as we understand that today. The Gospel of John, however, is very different. It is not a synopsis, but more of a theological treatise. The Jesus we encounter in John is one who is aware of his God self as much as he is aware of his human self. This is by far the most divine Jesus, who right from the beginning of John is proclaimed as being with God in creation. And John says that Jesus is now tenting or tabernacling among us. And eventually this Jesus will be glorified in his death and then resurrected. This way I have just described John's gospel, as true as it is a lot of words that don't really have any grounding in our day-to-day lives. One of the brilliant things about this gospel is that John knew that too. And so the Jesus we meet is one who teaches us complex theological concepts with the real stuff of our lives: darkness and light, water and food, blindness and sight, life and death. The encounters Jesus has with others in this gospel give Jesus the opportunity to introduce a sacramental understanding of our lives, the outward and visible as reflective and illuminating the inward and spiritual grace. For example, in the feeding of the 5,000, when Jesus takes a small amount of food, blesses it, and gives it to the people with enough for leftovers, this is not so much about feeding the people with food that will leave them hungry again. Rather, it's an outward and visible sign of the spiritual food of relationship with God, a food that curbs our human appetites and allows us to find our life in God, all that we need in God. Today's gospel is much the same. Unfortunately, the way our cycle of readings works, we miss out on the encounter that Jesus has with Nicodemus that leads Jesus to speak the words that we hear in the gospel. In John 3, Nicodemus, who is a leader of the Jews, comes to Jesus by night. He tells Jesus that he knows that Jesus comes from God because no one can do the signs and wonders Jesus does apart from God. From there, the two engage in a discussion about birth and rebirth. Just as children are born from the womb of their mothers, so too are children of God born from the womb of God, born of water and spirit. Jesus says, what is born of the flesh is flesh, and what is born of the spirit is spirit. Here he takes the outward and visible sign, this concrete reality of human life in the biological process of birth, and shows us the inward and spiritual grace of being born as children of God. Then Jesus teaches us about himself and why he has come into the world. And we hear that oft-quoted John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." Now this is where it gets sticky. How do we reconcile a God who so loved the world with a theological position of some being saved and some not being saved. I don't think we can reconcile it, actually. We can consider the context of John's writing. He was in a community that was living on the margins of that culture around 90 CE or AD, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. He was writing to encourage and solidify his community with all the difficulties they were experiencing. And we read this text 2,000 years later, in a place where we are free to believe as we like and are so moved, and without threat of persecution. As such, it reads very differently to us than to John. And when we forget the sacramental nature of John's gospel, that there's always these two levels of things going on, outward and visible, inward and spiritual, we can really miss what the text has to offer us. Have you all seen the football fans with their John 3:16 sign? Yes. I'm not really sure what John 3:16 has to do with football, but it does give us a little insight into the more popular and current interpretation of this verse, which is out of its literary context and out of its historical context. Now, this verse has become a kind of code language with all the best intentions, I know, but it's code nevertheless, saying, I believe and I am in, I'm holding up this sign. And those who don't believe, well, you're out. I am right, you are wrong. I am saved, you are condemned. It sets up an us and them mentality that does not serve anyone. The fact of the matter is that no one knows who is in and who is out. We make choices about what we believe, what we stand behind, what we hope for. But salvation is up to God alone. What is important for us in this gospel text is not getting hung up on the us and them issue, the salvation versus condemnation issue, but reading the text sacramentally. What is the inward and spiritual grace we receive in this part of John's gospel? Or another way to put it, how do we read this text from the perspective of living inside ourselves now, rather than looking outside of us for proof of who is saved and who isn't, and what will happen when we die? How each of us reads this will be as unique as we are, and as unique as our individual relationship with God is. It is important to remember that God so loved the world, and that Jesus is the outward and visible sign of this love. What does this mean to you? How do you experience this love of God inside your heart and your soul? For me, I experience the love of God as grace in difficult times, presence when I feel lonely, a way through when I feel like I can't go any further. I experience God so loving the world as a desire in me to serve, to be one small light of Christ in the world, so that others may know the powerful, healing love of God in their lives. It comes from the inside, this perspective, and not from outward proclamations of eternal consequences. For God so loved the world that he gave Jesus to us, that we might have life in his name. What does this mean to you inside your heart and soul? What grace does this outward and visible sign of God's love in the person of Jesus give to you, inward and spiritually? This is where the life in today's gospel reading is found.